This story begins with a decision that most people would never make. In the middle of the worst blizzard to hit Chicago in 30 years, when the entire city had gone dark and silent under the crushing cold, a night shift emergency nurse stumbled upon a stranger, lying motionless beneath a collapsed steel scaffolding in a pitch-black alley. He was bleeding out, freezing to death by the minute, and the tailored suit on his body cost more than her entire year's salary. She didn't know who he was. Didn't know that just minutes earlier, 3 black sedans had chased him through 4 city blocks. Didn't know that the man gasping for air at her feet ran an empire that the Chicago Police Department had been tracking for 14 years without ever getting close. She knew only one thing: this man was going to die if nobody did something right now. So she knelt down in the deep snow, pulled out her emergency first aid kit, and began saving the life of one of the most dangerous men in the city. She had no idea that her decision that night would pull her into a world she never could have imagined. A world where trust was the most expensive thing money couldn't buy, where loving the wrong person could cost her life, and where the most powerful man she had ever met turned out to be the only one who never once made her choices for her. This is their story. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so others can hear it too. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. See you in the next one. 30 minutes before that night shift, Nurse dropped to her knees in the snow. Astor Grayson was sitting across from a man he had once called an ally. The meeting was being held in a converted warehouse in the industrial district on the south side of Chicago, the kind of place no outsider would ever find unless someone led them there. Astor had come here dozens of times. He knew every exit, every blind corner. But tonight, that familiar room carried a different smell. The kind of smell that 14 years at the head of the Grayson family had taught him to recognize. The smell of betrayal trying to hide itself behind a polite smile. When he walked in, Astor was asked to surrender his personal weapon. A security procedure. Nothing unusual in a meeting like this. He complied. Perry, his right hand, was kept outside in the car, which was also procedure. Everything looked proper. But tonight, procedure was the trap. Wrapped carefully in the shell of something familiar. Astor realized that when the conversation changed direction, the questions became too probing. The man across from him glanced toward the back door too many times, and when the rhythm of engines outside in the lot shifted, not one vehicle but 3 arriving at once, Astor understood. He didn't wait for confirmation. He rose, shoved the iron table forward to create distance, and lunged for the back door. The back door opened into a narrow alley between 2 warehouse buildings. The wind cut straight across his face. Snow was falling so heavily that Astor could only see a few yards ahead. He ran, his legs driving through snow up to his knees, each step like stomping into wet concrete. Behind him came the pounding of feet in pursuit, shouts swallowed by the wind yet still close enough for him to know the distance was shrinking. Astor turned left at the first corner and ran along the barbed wire fence surrounding the abandoned industrial grounds. He knew this area. This was Southern territory, Grayson family ground. He remembered the gap in the fence behind the old warehouses at the far end of the row, wide enough for one man to slip through. He had used that way when he was young, before he had a car of his own, before he had an escort, before he had a name that made the whole city think twice before opening its mouth. He turned into the alley. The darkness was thick. The snow buried everything. He drove toward the end, searching for the break in the fence. But what he saw made his steps stop short. A pile of iron scaffolding from an unfinished repair project had collapsed and sealed off the only escape. Snow had been collecting on the old metal frame all day, the weight pulling the whole scaffolding system loose from the warehouse wall and bringing it crashing down, turning the alley into a dead end. Astor spun around, intending to find another way. At that exact moment, the remaining scaffolding on the opposite wall gave way as well. The metal let out a groan for half a second, and then a long steel beam dropped. Astor avoided the leading edge, but the beam struck his right shoulder, slammed across his back, and pinned him to the snow-covered concrete. The iron edge sliced through the fabric of his suit and cut a long gash across his left side. His right arm was trapped beneath the wreckage. He tried to shove upward with his left hand. The steel beam didn't move. Snow kept falling, covering him in thin layers, patient and merciless. At the mouth of the alley, the footsteps of the men chasing him drew closer, then stopped at the corner. From where he lay, Astor heard them arguing, torn between 2 directions. He could hear enough to know they didn't know where to turn. The snowstorm had erased his tracks within minutes. The alley itself was black, with no lights, No sign that anyone had just run into it. They chose the straight route, because when people are fleeing, instinct always drives them forward, and no one willingly turns into a dead end. The footsteps grew fainter, then disappeared completely into the wind. Astor lay still. He had escaped the men chasing him, but now he was caught in another trap, one set not by a traitorous ally and not by any enemy, but by the night, the snow, and the cold of 28 degrees below zero eating slowly through every cell in his body. He knew better than anyone that with the amount of blood he was losing and the temperature dropping, if no one found him in the next 20 minutes, tonight would be the last night of Astor Grayson. In 14 years of running an empire, he had planned for every scenario, but freezing to death beneath a pile of twisted steel in an alley inside his own territory had never once made the list. At the same time, less than 6 blocks from that alley, Maren Caldwell pushed open the back door of Mercy Hospital and stepped outside, and the cold hit her straight in the face like a wall. Her 14-hour shift had just ended. Her legs felt heavy, her eyes burned from lack of sleep, and the smell of antiseptic still clung to the skin of her hands. The employee parking lot behind the hospital was empty. Snow layered thick across the roofs of the cars in long white blankets. Maren opened the car door and turned the key. Nothing happened. She tried again. The engine didn't make a sound. The battery had died in the night cold, and this wasn't the first time it had happened with her 12-year-old car. Maren pulled out her phone. The screen stayed black. It had died halfway through her shift, and she had forgotten to charge it. She sat in the car for a moment, both hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the snow fall through the windshield. No car, no phone, no one to call. 3 years working the night shift in the Southside emergency room had taught Maren one very clear thing. Sitting and waiting was never an option. She tightened the scarf around her neck, pulled the hood of her coat over her head, shoved both hands into her gloves, and stepped back out of the car. 6 blocks. 15 minutes if she walked fast. The shortcut through the southern industrial district was a route she had taken for 3 straight years. She could have found her way home with her eyes closed. The wind blew straight across her face, the snow lashing her cheeks like fine sand. Maren lowered her head and walked quickly, counting each block in her mind. The industrial district at night was deserted. Nothing but the sound of wind slipping through the gaps between abandoned warehouses and the sound of metal striking metal somewhere high above. She had gone 4 blocks when she passed the mouth of a narrow alley between 2 old warehouses. She almost kept walking, but then her feet stopped. There was a sound, not the wind, not metal. Maren stood still and tilted her head, listening, breathing, heavy, uneven, trying to hold itself together and failing to hide what it was. It was the kind of breathing she had heard thousands of times in the emergency room. The breathing of someone fighting not to pass out, of a body struggling against something larger than will. The instinct of an emergency room nurse wouldn't let her keep walking. Maren turned into the alley. Her eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness. Then she saw him. A man lying beneath a collapsed tangle of steel scaffolding, half his body already covered in white snow. Maren dropped to her knees at once. Her hands moved with the reflex of her profession, fast and precise. She checked his airway. Clear. She pressed lightly against the top of his foot. The leg drew back. No spinal injury. The steel beam was pinned across his back and holding his right shoulder to the ground, but it wasn't pressing on the spine. A long tear in his left side was bleeding through the dark fabric of his suit, soaking it black. Moderate blood loss, not critical yet, but with the cold eating into his body minute by minute, there wasn't much time left. Maren tried to lift the steel beam with both hands. It didn't move. She looked around through the wreckage and saw a short length of iron pipe, about half a yard long, lying near the wall. She picked it up, slid it beneath the beam, and used it as leverage. She dropped her full body weight onto the end of the pipe. The beam lifted a few inches. Rusted steel sliced across her palm, opening a long cut, and she clenched her teeth and didn't let go. The beam rose a little more, enough for him to pull his shoulder free. The man tried to stand, lasted half a second, then collapsed again. His leg wasn't injured, but his body had been out in the cold too long. His muscles were seizing, his reactions dulled. Maren slipped her shoulder beneath his arm. She didn't even reach his shoulder in height, but she locked herself under him and took most of his weight. He was at least 30 kilograms heavier than she was. Maren stepped, and he dragged along beside her, 1 step at a time through the deep snow. 2 blocks. On an ordinary day, she would have walked it in 3 minutes. That night it took nearly 20. When they reached the stairwell of the old apartment building, she lowered him onto the landing at the first floor so he could rest, then hauled him upward again to the second. Stopped. Then the third. At every floor, her shoulders went numb. Her knees began to shake, but she didn't stop. Maren Caldwell didn't know how to stop when someone needed her. That was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. She lowered him onto the only bed in the small apartment on the third floor. Then she opened the personal emergency medical kit she always carried with her, a habit she had never broken in 3 years. She cleaned the torn wound with betadine, stitched it temporarily with the small suture kit, then wrapped it in a pressure bandage. Her hands worked fast, neat, without a second of hesitation. His blood was on her fingers, mingling with the blood from the cut in her own palm. But Maren didn't look down at her hand. She never looked down at her own hand while someone else still needed care. Aster Grayson didn't know exactly when he opened his eyes. The first thing he noticed was the ceiling, low, with peeling paint, and a crack running in a crooked line from the corner of the room, almost to the dead overhead light. The second thing was the smell, the scent of betadine mixed with candle wax and old cloth. The third thing was the pain. His left side burned every time he drew a breath. His right shoulder throbbed with a deep, dull ache, and his whole body felt as heavy as if it had been filled with lead. But Aster didn't move. He didn't open his eyes fully. He only lifted his lids enough to see through his lashes. And then he began to do what 14 years at the head of the family had turned into instinct. He read the room. The apartment was small, probably no more than 30 square meters. The furniture was old, sparse, and there was nothing in it worth stealing. No camera, no electronic device still running, because the power was out. Only 2 candles stood on the wooden table near the window, their light small and flickering. This wasn't the kind of place an enemy would use to hold someone. Too poor, too real, too empty of design. Then he saw her. The woman was sitting on the other side of the room on a plastic chair pushed against the wall, one leg drawn up, her back resting in the corner. She was reading a worn paperback, reading by candlelight, her eyes moving slowly over the page. She was wearing nurse's clothes, pale blue scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, with a loose sweater pulled over them against the cold. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't watching him with the tense alertness of someone guarding a hostage or monitoring a target. She was simply sitting there, tired and quiet, as if having a strange man lying in her bed in the middle of a snowstorm was something she had already dealt with. And now she was waiting, not waiting for him to wake so she could question him, but waiting for the next time his bandage needed changing. Aster kept pretending to sleep, not because he was afraid of her, because he didn't trust her yet. In Aster's world, no one did anything without a reason. No one dragged a strange man who weighed half again as much as she did through a snowstorm and up 3 flights of stairs without wanting something in return. He needed time to figure out what that something was. So he lay still, kept his breathing even, watched through half-closed eyes, and waited. But Maren Caldwell had looked at patients thousands of times in her 3 years working the night shift in the emergency room. She knew the breathing of someone truly asleep. Deep, steady, the muscles of the face loosened, the eyelids still. And she knew the breathing of someone pretending. A little shallower, the chest a little tighter, the fingers now and then curling and uncurling by the smallest degree. She knew he had been awake for at least 20 minutes. She said nothing. She didn't expose him. She closed the book, stood, and walked to the bedside. She checked the bandage at his side, gently and professionally, her hands moving with such precision that they caused not one unnecessary spark of pain. She set a small bottle of water and 2 pain pills on the chair beside the bed, within his reach. Then she returned to the corner of the room, sat back down on the plastic chair, opened her book, and kept reading. She gave him something that perhaps no one in his world had ever given him before. Time. Space. The right to decide whether to trust or not trust without being forced. Outside the window, the snowstorm howled through the gaps in the old wooden frame. The wind hit in hard bursts, rattling the thin panes of glass. The apartment was cold, warmed only by the 2 candles and the layers of blankets Maren had pulled over him. The city was in a widespread blackout. No heat, no phone signal, no way to go outside. 2 strangers were shut inside, less than 30 square meters, in the longest night of a Chicago winter. One lay in the bed pretending to sleep, so he could judge whether the other was a threat. The other sat in the chair, knowing perfectly well that he was pretending, but choosing not to say so, because she understood that trust wasn't something you could force another person to give. It had to be offered freely. And she, more than anyone, knew the cost of trusting the wrong person. So she waited. He waited too. And the small apartment on the third floor sank into that strange silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of two people reading one another before either had reached the final page. On the morning of the second day, when the candlelight had nearly burned itself out, and the blizzard outside still showed no sign of easing, Marin sat on the edge of the kitchen table, trying to clean the scrape across the palm of her right hand by herself. The gash from the rusted edge of the steel beam she had pried loose the night before had now swollen red, and the skin around it was beginning to inflame. She held the bottle of betadine in her left hand, tilted it, and tried to pour it over the open palm of her right hand. But her left hand was unsteady. The bottle tipped too far, and the liquid spilled across the table instead. She set the bottle down, tore off a piece of gauze with her teeth and her left hand, then tried to wrap it around the palm of her right hand. The gauze sat crooked and slipped loose. She tried again. It slipped loose again. From the bed, Aster lay still, eyes closed, keeping the steady breathing rhythm of a sleeping man. But he saw everything. Through the narrow opening of his lashes, he watched her struggle with the roll of bandage one-handed, watched the antiseptic run down over the tabletop, watched the swollen red scrape on her hand, and he knew exactly where it had come from. She had been hurt prying the steel beam off him, and for more than 12 hours, she had dressed his wound every 4 hours, on time, professional, never missing a beat, while her own injury had not been touched even once. Aster did not calculate. For the first time in many years, he did something without weighing whether it would help or hurt, whether it was safe or dangerous. He sat up, not slowly, not with the pretense of just waking. He sat straight up, swung himself off the bed, and crossed the 2 steps to where she was. Marin looked up, her left hand still holding the loose strip of gauze against her right palm. She looked at him, slightly startled, not because she was afraid, but because she had known for a long time that he was awake, and now he was breaking the very performance both of them had silently understood. Aster said nothing. He took the bandage roll from her hand, pulled out the chair, sat down across from her, placed her right hand on his knee, and began to wrap it. His fingers were large, with faint scars across the knuckles, but the way he wrapped the bandage was strangely slow and careful. Not the work of a medic, but the work of someone who had dressed his own wounds many times and knew what pain felt like when a bandage was pulled too tight. He wrapped it just firmly enough, not loose, not harsh, and then let her hand go. Neither of them spoke a word through any of it. But when he released her hand and sat back, the air in that small third-floor apartment had changed. The silence between them was no longer the taut silence of the previous night. It was lighter, not comfortable, not yet, but the silence of 2 people who had quietly accepted that the pretending was over. From that moment on, everything shifted, slightly but clearly. Marin still changed his bandages every 4 hours, still professional, still sparing with words. She did not ask his name. She did not ask who had hurt him. She did not ask why a man in a tailored suit had been lying beneath a collapsed scaffold in a dark alley. That refusal to ask, for a man like Aster, a man whose entire life had been filled with people wanting something from him, money, power, protection, information, was the thing that drew his attention most sharply. She wanted nothing from him. She only changed the bandages, set down water, and returned to her corner of the room. Aster began to watch her with different eyes, not the eyes of a man searching for danger anymore, but the eyes of someone trying to understand. There was not much food in the apartment. Marin divided it evenly into 2 portions each meal, but the portion she placed beside his bed was always a little larger than the one she ate at the kitchen table. Not so much larger that it would seem obvious, but enough for a man who had lived by measuring everything to notice. She gave him more because he had lost blood and needed the energy more than she did. She thought he didn't know. He knew. On the afternoon of the second day, Marin was sitting at the kitchen table, her left hand turning the pages of the book while her right lay open on the wood. The scrape had turned redder now, the skin around the edge beginning to gather a little pus. She glanced at it, then turned another page and did nothing. Aster watched from the bed, and for the first time since waking, he spoke. "When did your hand get hurt?" Marin didn't lift her eyes from the book. "It doesn't matter. You dress my wound every 4 hours. You leave yours to get infected." Marin stopped. Her finger stayed where it rested at the edge of the page and did not turn it. She still did not look at him. Silence lasted for a few seconds, and then she spoke, her voice soft, without complaint, without self-pity. Only with the sound of a truth so old to her that it no longer felt unusual. I'm used to it. Taking care of things myself has always been easier. That sentence was not about the wound in her hand. Both of them knew it. The fever came at the end of the second day without warning and without building slowly. It came as though Aster's body had held everything back for as long as it could and had now decided to let go. Marin was changing his bandage on the exact 4-hour schedule when she realized it the moment her hand touched his skin. Hot, not the ordinary warmth of a body healing, but a dry, searing heat burning from the inside, the kind of heat she had felt hundreds of times on infected patients in the emergency room. She opened the bandage. The temporary stitches along his left side were swollen, and the redness around the wound had spread farther than it had at the last check. Infection. She had disinfected it properly. She had stitched it cleanly, but her personal emergency bag held only first aid supplies, not oral antibiotics. And without antibiotics, no matter how skilled the hands were, the bacteria still won. Marin did what she could. She cleaned the wound again with betadine, gently but thoroughly. She tore strips from the cleanest towel she had left, soaked them in cold water from the reserve jug, and laid them across his forehead. She forced water into him in small sips, tilting the bottle against his mouth each time he was conscious enough to swallow. She changed the cold cloth again and again, every few minutes, because the fever soaked through it so fast that the cloth warmed almost as soon as she set it down. But the fever did not stop. It climbed higher, and when the body's temperature passed the point where will could hold it in place, Aster Grayson, the man who had spent 14 years controlling every word, every expression, every thought before it could show itself to the world, began to lose control. He shook. His whole body shook, not from cold, but from the fever twisting inside his skull. His eyes were open but saw nothing in this room. They were fixed on some other place, some other time. He began to speak. At first it was only unclear muttering, then louder. He called Perry's name in the voice of a man giving orders, urgent, sharp, as if he were still in the middle of a meeting that had never ended. He mentioned names, places, numbers, transactions that in his right mind he would never have let slip in front of anyone outside the narrowest circle of trust. He named a restaurant, the exact name, clearly, as though he were instructing someone to arrive at the proper place at the proper hour. Then his voice changed. Softer, younger. He called for his mother. Marin sat beside the bed and heard everything. She did not want to hear it. She did not need to know who he was or what kind of world turned around him, but the apartment was less than 30 square meters, and he was speaking louder than the wind outside, and there was no way for her not to hear. Names, places, broken commands spilled from his mouth like water from a burst dam. She heard them, and she remembered them, because her mind had been trained by 3 years in the emergency room to retain every important detail in the middle of chaos. But she did not react. She only kept changing the cold cloth, forcing water into him, checking his pulse with 2 fingers pressed against his wrist. She had been awake for more than 30 hours, a 14-hour shift, then dragging him home, then the first night watching over him, then the second day, and now the second night. Her eyes burned, her shoulders ached. Each time she stood to fetch more cold water, her knees trembled slightly, but she did not lie down. She did not sleep, because she knew better than anyone that the fever of an infection, if it was not watched without interruption, could kill a person in a matter of hours, and in this apartment there was no one but her. At the height of the delirium, when Aster was rambling out orders that no one in this room could carry out, when his body was shaking so hard that the old bed creaked beneath every wave of it, his hand suddenly reached out and caught hers. Hard. That large hand, with the faint scars across the knuckles, closed around her smaller one, as though it were the only thing keeping him from being swept away. He did not know that he was holding it. He did not know whose hand he had taken. But his body knew. And it clung. Marin did not pull away. She let him hold her. She sat on the floor beside the bed, her back resting against the bed frame, her right hand trapped tightly in his, while her left still reached up to change the cold cloth on his forehead. Outside, the blizzard howled through the cracks in the window frame. The candles had almost burned to nothing, and the apartment was nearly swallowed by darkness. In that darkness, Marin sat holding the hand of a man whose name she did not know, whose origin she did not know, whose identity she did not know. And for the first time in many months, since Jess had taken all the money and disappeared, since she had told herself that needing anyone was the same as placing a knife in their hand. Marin Caldwell did not feel alone. The fever broke at dawn on the third day. There was no clear turning point, no dramatic sign announcing it in advance. Astor's body simply stopped fighting itself. The shaking eased, his breathing slowed, and the cold sheen of sweat on his forehead began to dry. Astor opened his eyes. This time he was not peering through half-lowered lashes to observe. He opened them fully, awake, clear-headed, and the first thing he saw was his own hand. His right hand was holding someone else's. He followed that arm downward and saw her. Marin was sitting on the floor beside the bed, her back resting against the wall, her head tilted to one side, her eyes closed. She had fallen asleep in that position, sitting upright on the cold concrete floor, with no blanket, no pillow, only the loose sweater pulled tightly around her body. The dark circles beneath her eyes were so deep they looked like bruises. Her lips were dry and cracked, and in her left hand she was still holding the damp cloth, which had long since dried against her knee, ready to lay it across his forehead again if needed. Even though she was so exhausted, she could no longer keep her eyes open. But her right hand was still in his. She had not pulled it away. Even in sleep, she had not pulled it away. Astor looked at her. He looked at her longer than he had looked at any person in the past 14 years. Not to judge, not to read, simply to look. And in that stretch of silence, as the pale light of a gray morning began to slip through the cracks in the window frame, Astor Grayson felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel. He was in debt, not the kind of debt he knew well, the kind from his world, debts of favors, protection, promises between men who measured everything in power and money. This was a different kind of debt, the kind no sum of money, no privilege, no repayment could ever erase, because this woman had given him what she had no obligation to give: her time, her sleep, her strength, 30 hours awake after a 14-hour shift, and she had given it without ever asking who he was. Then memory came back, not memory of the fever itself, because his body did not remember that part clearly. It was awareness instead. He remembered that he had spoken. He remembered that his mouth had opened, and he knew very well that in delirium he had no control over what came spilling out. Names, places, transactions, orders, things that, in the wrong ears, could bring the entire Grayson family crashing down, or leave him buried beneath some slab of concrete where no one would ever find him. The instinct of 14 years came back in an instant. Astor gently withdrew his hand from Marin's, not hard enough to wake her, but enough to free himself. He lay still, looking up at the ceiling, and began to calculate. How much had she heard? Did she understand what she had heard? Did she know the value of that information? And most important of all, what would she do with it? In Astor's world, there were only two possible answers to a situation like this, and neither one was kind. Marin woke 10 minutes later. She opened her eyes, blinked several times, then lifted her head and looked at him. When she saw that his eyes were open and looking straight at her, she paused for one beat. She did not panic. She did not hurry. She simply checked him in silence, her nurse's eyes moving quickly over his face, assessing skin tone, breathing rhythm, level of alertness. Then she laid the back of her hand against his forehead, checking his temperature. The fever had fallen. She let out a quiet breath of relief, almost too soft to hear, only a little longer than an ordinary exhale. Astor said nothing. He looked at her, and she knew he was looking at her differently, not with the weary eyes of a patient who had just come through a fever, but with sharp, clear eyes, weighing something. She had seen enough kinds of eyes in 3 years working the night shift on the South Side to know when a person was deciding whether she was an ally or a threat. "You talked a lot in your fever," Marin said, her voice calm, as though she were reporting test results to a patient. "I didn't hear a thing. I was busy keeping you from dying." She lied. They both knew it. Marin had heard everything. She had heard names she did not recognize, places she had never been, orders belonging to a world entirely removed from the emergency room at Mercy Hospital. But she chose not to know. Not because she was afraid, because she understood that for the man lying in her bed, information was the most dangerous thing in the world, and she had just given him something that perhaps no one in his world had ever given him before: absolute safety. She made herself into a person who knew nothing, so that he would not have to make a decision neither of them wanted him to make. Astor looked at her. He could read people better than most men on Earth, And he read that lie as clearly as if it were written in a contract. But he also read what lay behind it. She was not hiding the information to use as leverage. She was not keeping the secret to bargain with him later. She was hiding it because she wanted him to have peace. And that was something Aster Grayson, in 14 years standing at the top of an empire built on distrust, had never once been given by anyone. On the 4th day, Maren woke because of light. Not candlelight. The ceiling light. The power had come back. She was lying on the living room floor, where she had slept for the past 3 nights, because the bed had been given to him, and the first thing she realized was that the wind had gone quiet. The blizzard had stopped. Not faded gradually, but stopped completely, as though someone had flipped a switch. Through the window, the sky was still gray but still, and the snow on the street had already begun to soften beneath the weak light of morning. Maren stood up, her back stiff from 3 nights of sleeping on concrete. She looked toward the bed. Aster was awake, lying still, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The fever had fully broken the night before. His face was still pale, but a faint color had returned to it. He was more alert now than he had been at any point since she had dragged him out from beneath the twisted steel in the alley. She walked over and checked the bandage at his side one final time. The infection had eased, the swelling had gone down, and the redness had not spread any farther. His body had managed to fight it off through sheer resistance, and through 30 hours of cold cloths, betadine, and water she had forced him to drink 1 swallow at a time. He would need antibiotics. He would need the wound stitched properly. He would need scans to make sure there was no internal damage. But he was going to live. "You need a hospital," Maren said in the professional voice of a nurse, not in the voice of the woman who had spent 3 nights on the floor because of him. "No hospital," Aster answered. Brief, no explanation. But Maren didn't need one. She was an emergency room nurse on the south side. She knew the rules. The hospital had to report any wound that looked suspicious to the police. And the long gash in his side, clearly not the result of some ordinary household accident, would trigger that process the moment he walked in. She did not ask again. She gave a slight nod, packed the first aid supplies back into her bag, and stepped into the kitchen to heat water. Her phone had charged once the electricity came back, but before she could even turn it on, the sound of engines drifted up from the street below. Not one vehicle. Several. Maren stepped to the window and looked down. A line of black cars had pulled up along the narrow street outside the apartment building, standing out in the south side like black stones scattered across dirty white snow. She turned and looked at Aster. He did not seem surprised. He only closed his eyes for 1 second, drew in a slow breath, and sat up. The way he sat up was different now. Not the heavy, fighting motion of a sick man anymore. He sat straight, swung his legs down from the bed, and stood. Slowly, but with control. He looked around the room as if searching for something. His suit jacket, the tailored jacket she had cut open on one side on the first night to treat the wound, had been folded neatly and draped over the back of the chair. Aster took it down, put it on, and fastened it with one hand because his right shoulder still hurt. Then he reached for the tie Maren had loosened and set aside that first night, neatly placed on the table. He tied it, slowly, precisely, each fold landing exactly where it belonged. And when the knot settled cleanly beneath his collar, Maren saw the change happen in front of her eyes. The patient who had lain in her bed for the past 3 days vanished. The man standing before her now was someone entirely different. His back straightened, his shoulders opened, his eyes cooled by several degrees, and suddenly the whole small room felt smaller because of his presence. She did not know exactly who he was, but she knew with certainty that the black cars below had come for him, and that the world he was about to step back into was nothing like anything inside this 30-square-meter apartment. A knock came at the door. Maren opened it. A man stood outside, around 40, solidly built, expressionless, his eyes sweeping over her in half a second before moving straight past her to Aster behind her. Perry. Maren did not know his name, but she recognized the type immediately, the kind of man trained to assess everything in a single glance. Aster stepped to the doorway. He stopped at the threshold, looked at Perry, and said only one sentence. Short, clear, low-voiced. "Make sure this apartment and the woman here stay safe." Perry nodded without asking a question. Then Aster walked away. He did not turn back to look at Maren. He did not say thank you. He did not promise he would return. He went down the stairs, each step a little slower than usual because of the wound. But his back was straight, his head lifted, and then his figure disappeared past the turn on the second floor. Perry remained at the door for a few more seconds and looked at Marin once more. No nod, no greeting. Then he followed after him. Marin closed the door. She stood alone in the middle of the apartment. The engines below started, then faded, then disappeared altogether. The room was still exactly the same. Still small, still old, still with its single bed, still with the plastic chair in the corner, still with the 2 candles burned down to nothing but hardened pools of wax, but it felt emptier. Empty in a way Marin did not want to admit. She walked to the window and looked down at the street, wet with melting snow. The black cars were completely gone, as if they had never been there at all. Marin stood there a little longer, then reminded herself in the silent voice inside her head, familiar and hard as an old prayer. Don't get used to anyone's presence. A week passed. Marin went back to her night shifts in the Mercy emergency room, as though nothing had happened. She still arrived on time, still wore her pale blue scrubs, still handled each patient with hands that were quick and precise. No one at the hospital knew that the week before, she had stayed awake for 3 nights on the floor of her apartment to keep a strange man alive. Marin told no one, because Marin had no one to tell, and because to her, it was something finished, something closed, like every shift that ended the moment she stepped out through the hospital doors. But when she came home after her shift, on the 7th night since the black cars had disappeared, she found something set outside the door of her 3rd-floor apartment, a rigid box, not large, with no brand on the outside, and a white envelope resting on top of it. Marin stopped and looked down. She didn't need to open the box to know who it was from. No one else had any reason to leave anything outside her door, and no one else knew exactly which floor she lived on or which apartment was hers. She carried both inside. She opened the box first. A professional emergency medical kit, military grade, almost certainly worth 10 times more than the first aid bag she had bought for herself. She looked at it without any obvious change in expression, but her hand moved lightly across the surface of the case and she knew at once that it was real, high quality, the kind of thing any emergency nurse would want in her bag. Then she opened the envelope. Cash, a lot of it. No letter, no name, not a single handwritten word. Marin set the envelope of money on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she tore a sheet from her shift notebook and wrote one short line in blue ballpoint pen. I don't need repayment. Return this to your boss. She folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope with all the cash, and left the envelope on the hallway windowsill outside, where she knew someone would come to collect it. The medical kit she kept, because it was useful. And Marin Caldwell did not refuse useful things. She only refused money. The envelope reached Perry the following morning. Perry carried it into Astor's office on the upper floor of a real estate tower in downtown Chicago, set it on the desk, and said only that she had sent it back. Astor opened the envelope, counted it, every bill accounted for, not one missing. He pulled out the scrap of paper and read the sentence written in blue ballpoint pen. He read it a second time, and then he smiled. Perry stood there and witnessed something that, in 11 years beside Astor, he could hardly believe he was seeing. Astor Grayson smiled, not the thin smile he used in negotiations to make the other side drop its guard, not the polite smile he wore when receiving guests at strategic dinners, but a real smile, the kind that appeared without permission, the corner of the mouth lifting before control could catch it, the eyes growing a little brighter, as if something had reached a place no one had touched. In all 14 years he had stood at the head of the Grayson empire. Perry said nothing, but he remembered that moment, because he knew it mattered in a way he did not yet fully understand. That afternoon, Astor told Perry to drive down to the south side. Perry checked the area first by habit, confirmed it was safe, then parked at the corner 1 block from the apartment building. Astor got out alone, went inside, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the door of the 3rd-floor apartment. Marin opened it. She had just woken after her night shift, her hair twisted up in haste, the side of her face still marked from the pillow. When she saw who was standing outside her door, she stopped. Not from fear, not from pleasure, just from real surprise, the kind that belongs to someone who never expects anyone to come, because she has grown used to expecting no one. I need someone to monitor a post-surgical wound, Astor said. His voice was calm, almost businesslike, but Marin looked into his eyes and knew it was an excuse. His wound had certainly already been handled by a private doctor. He did not need a Southside night shift nurse to monitor anything. I don't work for anyone except the hospital, Marin answered. Not cold, not warm, just the truth. I'm not hiring you. I'll go to the clinic you choose, on the schedule you set, like any ordinary patient. Marin looked at him. He stood outside her apartment in a dark suit, tie knotted perfectly, back straight, shoulders open, looking nothing like the man who had lain shaking in her bed 1 week earlier. But she saw the faint line at the corner of his eyes when he shifted slightly, saw that the wound in his left side still hurt when he moved, and she knew that no matter how skilled a private doctor might be, a wound first stitched with a field kit from a nurse's emergency bag still needed to be checked properly. Tuesday and Friday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the community clinic on Halsted Street, Marin said. Be on time. She closed the door before he could reply. Aster stood in the hallway for 2 more seconds, looking at the old wooden door, then turned and went back down the stairs. When he got into the car, Perry looked at him in the rearview mirror and saw his boss sitting in the back seat with an expression Perry could describe with only one word. Peaceful. And that was not a word Perry had ever used for Aster Grayson in 11 years. Aster Grayson arrived at the community clinic on Halsted Street at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. Exactly on time. Not 1 minute early, not 1 minute late. Marin watched him walk in wearing a dark suit in a waiting room full of patients in hoodies and torn jeans, and she almost wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the image, but she didn't laugh. She called his name from the patient list, the real name he had registered under, as though he were only an ordinary man who needed his stitches checked. He came on time that Friday, then the following Tuesday, then the Friday after that. In Aster's world, the whole city waited for him. He didn't wait for anyone. Meetings began when he entered the room, not when the clock reached the appointed hour. But at the community clinic on Halsted Street, he sat on a plastic chair in the waiting room and waited for Marin to call his name, and he was never late. The wound healed little by little, but the follow-up visits did not stop. There were things that began to happen without either of them speaking them aloud. At the third follow-up, while Marin was checking the stitches, Aster noticed the paper cup on her desk. Black coffee, no sugar, gone cold, half finished. He said nothing. But at the fourth follow-up, when Marin opened the exam room door, there was already a hot double espresso sitting on her desk. No name, no note. She looked at the coffee, then looked at Aster sitting in the chair reading something on his phone, his face expressionless, as though the cup had appeared on her desk by magic. She didn't say thank you. She only drank it. From then on, every time he came for a follow-up, a hot double espresso was already waiting on her desk before she entered the room. Marin never asked. Aster never admitted anything. A week later, the pipe in Marin's apartment burst. In a Chicago winter, that was nothing unusual in old apartment buildings. Water seeped through the kitchen wall and ran across the floor. Marin set a bucket beneath it and called the landlord, just as she always did, already knowing she would have to wait at least 2 weeks, because the landlord was never in a hurry to fix anything in that neighborhood. But the next morning, when she came home after her night shift, a plumber was standing outside her door with a full set of tools, saying he had been called for an emergency repair. Marin had not called anyone. The landlord had not called anyone. She knew who had. She let the plumber in and said nothing, and when the work was done and he refused payment because it had already been covered, she only nodded and closed the door. Then came that night. Marin got off later than usual, close to 3 o'clock in the morning. Her shift stretched long by a chain reaction highway collision that had poured patients into the emergency room without pause. She stepped out through the back door of the hospital, so tired she was almost walking by instinct alone. And then she saw it, the black car parked at the corner of the street, about half a block from the hospital, the engine idling softly, the lights turned off. No one got out, no one said a word. The car simply sat there, silent and patient, as though it had been there since the moment her shift began, and would remain there until she walked out. Marin stopped and looked at the car. She was angry, because she had not asked anyone to watch over her, and she did not need someone deciding she required protection without asking her first. But at the same time, in the South Side after midnight, after 16 hours on her feet, with her legs trembling from exhaustion and the dark street stretching ahead of her, Marin felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Safe. She hated that feeling almost as much as she needed it. She turned her back and walked home without looking at the car again, but she knew it followed her until she stepped inside the stairwell of her apartment building. Marin had her own ways too. She did not send gifts, did not make phone calls, did not offer easy, warm words, but she was a nurse. and she read the human body the way others read an open book. After several follow-ups, she realized Aster was chronically sleep-deprived. His eyes always held faint red threads. His blood pressure ran higher than it should for a man of 33. His pulse was faster than it ought to have been. He was a man who did not sleep, or did not allow himself to sleep, or had no one around him to remind him that the human body is not a machine. At the next follow-up, when Aster stood and began fastening the buttons of his suit jacket after she finished checking the wound, Maren said nothing. She simply tore a small sheet from her notebook, wrote several lines by hand, folded it in half, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, quick and natural, as though she did such a thing every day. Aster glanced down, about to pull it out and read it, but Maren had already turned away to call in the next patient. He read the note in the car on the drive back. A sleep schedule, handwritten, with clear bullet points, specifying the hours he should sleep, the hours he should wake, the minimum amount of rest the body required, written with all the seriousness of a prescription. Aster folded the paper and slipped it into his wallet, into the card compartment. Perry glanced into the rearview mirror and saw his boss place a small piece of paper into his wallet as though he were storing something precious, and he could not make sense of it. But Perry did not ask. Perry never asked questions when instinct told him the answer was bigger than his own understanding. There was one thing Aster Grayson did with everyone who entered the orbit of his life, whether they were partners, allies, or someone he had begun to care about. He tested them, not because he was cruel, but because 14 years at the head of an empire had taught him that loyalty was only real when it could survive pressure, and the only way to know whether someone would stay or walk away was to push them first, and then see what they did. So he let Perry do it. Not as a formal order, only as an offhand remark, the kind Perry understood at once. And Perry, the man who had stood beside Aster for 11 years, the man who understood his boss's unspoken language more clearly than anyone else, found a way to meet Maren before the next follow-up appointment. He did not threaten her. He did not intimidate her. Perry only said enough for Maren to understand that the man she was examining twice a week was not an ordinary real estate businessman, that the world surrounding him was not safe, that anyone who stood close to him had to accept risks most people wanted no part of knowing. Then Perry gave a slight nod and left, leaving Maren with that information and the right to decide for herself. Aster waited. That Tuesday of the following week, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he sat in the waiting room of the community clinic on Halsted Street. He was not certain she would come. He had pushed her away, and 14 years of experience had taught him that most people, when given the chance to step out of the pull of power, would run, especially the intelligent ones. And Maren Caldwell was very intelligent. The clinic door opened. Maren stepped out, patient chart in hand, called his name from the list, her voice normal, professional, without the slightest ripple to suggest that anything had changed. She invited him into the examination room. She washed her hands, pulled on gloves, removed the old bandage, checked the stitches, and replaced the dressing. She took his blood pressure, recorded the numbers in the chart, all by the book, all in rhythm, just as she had every time before. When she pulled off the gloves, dropped them into the medical waste bin, and wrote the final note into the chart, Aster was still sitting on the examination table, waiting, watching. She set down the pen, turned to look at him, and spoke in a voice that was soft, neither cold nor warm, only the voice of truth spoken by someone too tired to pretend she cared about anything more than the work in front of her. If you want me to be afraid, you'll have to try harder. I work in a Southside emergency room. I've seen things scarier than you. She said nothing more. She did not explain. She did not ask whether he was dangerous, did not demand that he confirm or deny anything Perry had told her. She only said that one sentence, then opened the examination room door and called for the next patient. Aster stepped back into the waiting room. He stood there for a moment among the plastic chairs and the familiar smell of antiseptic, and he understood. She had not passed the test. She had not even known there was a test. She had simply been herself, and the self she was did not run. Aster Grayson had spent 14 years building his defenses, one layer over another, high walls and deep trenches, guarding himself from every direction. But that afternoon, on the drive back from the community clinic to the center of the city, he knew that the last layer of caution he still held against her had fallen, not because she had broken it, but because she had never once cared enough to try. The call came at 11 o'clock at night, right in the middle of her shift. Maren was washing her hands after finishing with a patient when the phone vibrated in the pocket of her scrubs. She dried her hands, pulled it out, and looked at the screen. Jess's number. Her sister. The number Maren had not seen flash across her screen since the day she discovered the savings account empty. $12,000. Every cent she had put away over 4 years, gone in a single night along with her sister. Maren answered. Jess did not apologize. She did not explain why she had left, why she had taken the money, why she had disappeared without a word. Jess was calling because she was in trouble and needed money. Her voice sounded the same as ever. Still the voice of the little sister Maren had been raising since she was 17. Still the voice Maren used to hear every night when she soothed her to sleep in that empty apartment after their father had walked out. Jess finished speaking. Maren said nothing. She ended the call. She placed the phone down on the table in the staff room, sat in the old swivel chair, and stared at the white wall in front of her. She did not cry. Maren Caldwell did not cry at the hospital. She only sat there, both hands resting on her thighs, eyes open, looking into that blank space while inside her chest, something twisted slowly, like a cord wound too many times. Her shift ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. Maren stepped out through the back door of the hospital. She did not go home. She stopped in the parking lot, looked down at her shoes, then up at the starless night sky, then down again, as though she could not remember where she had meant to go. The driver of the black car parked at the corner, the one who watched over her every night she worked, saw her standing there too long. He called Astor. 20 minutes later, another car pulled up in front of the hospital. Not the usual black one, Astor's own car, the one he drove himself when he wanted to separate from the escort. Astor stepped out and walked over to Maren. She stood in the parking lot, her coat still unzipped, her scarf hanging loose, watching him come without looking surprised and without looking annoyed. She only looked at him, and he looked at her, and he did not ask. He did not ask whether she was all right. He did not ask what had happened. He simply opened the passenger side door. Maren looked at the open door, then got into the car. Astor drove. He did not say where. He drove through the empty streets at night, through the south side, through downtown, northward, until the car stopped beside Lake Michigan. He turned off the engine. Ahead of them, the frozen water stretched beneath the black sky, silent, immense, cold, and completely empty. They sat in the car. No lights, no music, only the soft hum of the heater. Maren looked out at the lake. In the darkness, without having to look anyone in the eye, without having to wear the professional face of an emergency room nurse or the hard armor she had carried for so many years, Maren began to speak. She told him about Jess, not from the beginning, because the story from the beginning was too long and too heavy. She told him about the phone call tonight, about hearing her sister's voice after so many months of silence, and discovering that the very first thing her sister said was not, "Sister, I'm sorry," but, "Sister, I need money." She told him about the strangest feeling of all, the one she did not know how to name, the feeling of still loving someone who had taken everything from her, and hating herself for still loving her. Her voice did not shake. Her eyes stayed dry, but every word she spoke was heavy, as though it had lived in her chest too long, and now, once released, it dropped into the space between them with its own gravity. Astor listened. He did not interrupt. He did not nod. He did not say, "I understand," or "I'm sorry," or any of the things people usually say when they do not know what to say. He only sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the frozen lake, and he listened. When Maren stopped, silence stretched out between them. Not an awkward silence, only the emptiness that follows after someone has finally set down something very heavy. Then Astor spoke. His voice was low and slow, and Maren realized it was the first time she had heard him say more than 2 sentences in a row. He told her about his father. Not much. Only that he lost his father at 19, in a struggle for power he had not been able to stop in time. That on that night he had come home, stood in the living room, and looked at the armchair by the window where his father used to sit every evening, and saw it empty. That from that moment he understood, with no one telling him and no one teaching him, he simply understood that he was no longer allowed to be weak, no longer allowed to sit down, no longer allowed to stop, because if he stopped then everything his father had built would collapse, and he would be the one who had let it collapse. I didn't lose my father because he chose to leave. I lost him because this world took him from me. But the result is the same. The chair was still empty. He said nothing more after that sentence. Maren did not either. They sat in the car looking out at Lake Michigan, frozen beneath the black, starless sky. Two people separated by the narrow distance between the driver's seat and the passenger seat. No hands touching, no shoulders brushing. Only two people in the dark with their wounds. And for the first time, with no need to hide them. A few days after that night by the lake, Aster came to the Friday afternoon follow-up appointment. The wound was almost completely healed. Maren checked it one last time, removed the remaining stitches, disinfected the area, and placed a thin dressing over it. From a medical standpoint, he did not need to come back again. Both of them knew that. But when Maren wrote the final note in his chart and said that the wound was fine now and no further follow-up was needed, Aster did not stand at once. He sat on the examination table, looking down at his hands resting on his thighs, and stayed silent for a long while. Maren did not hurry him. She set down her pen, leaned lightly against the edge of the table, and waited. She had already learned that with this man, silence did not mean there was nothing to say. It meant he was trying to find a way to say something he had never said before. Then Aster began to speak, not about his father this time, about his mother. He told it briefly, without circling around it, his voice level and low as if he were reading a report about his own life. His mother left when he was 22, 3 years after his father died. 3 years in which she tried to endure life inside the family, tried to stay for her son, tried to pretend that the world around her was not crushing her a little more each day. Then one morning, Aster woke up and she was no longer there. No explanation, no phone call, no new address. She had simply vanished, as though she had never existed in that house at all. Aster did not go looking for her. Not because he did not want to, but because he understood. He understood that his mother had not left him. She had left his world, and those two things were different, but the result was the same. He had still lost her. 6 months after she left, she sent him a birthday card. It came through the mail with no return address, only his name on the envelope, and, inside, one single handwritten line. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough." Nothing more. There was never a second card. Aster kept that card in the drawer of his desk. 11 years. Not framed, not set out in the open, only lying in the drawer beneath files and papers, but always there. Perry was the only person who knew, because Perry was the only one who had ever seen Aster open that drawer on his birthday every year. Look at the card for a few seconds, then close it again. Maren listened. She did not say "I understand," because she knew she did not understand all of it. She did not say "she still loved you," because that was the kind of cheap comfort Maren hated most in the world, the kind of sentence people say to make themselves feel better. Not the person who has to hear it. She did not tell him to forgive. She did not tell him to let it go. She did not say anything at all. But she did one thing. She reached out slowly and gently and placed her hand on his forearm, not gripping, not stroking, only resting it there. Her hand, the hand of a night shift nurse, roughened by gloves and antiseptic soap, rested on his forearm, the arm of a mafia boss, with faint scars across the knuckles, and she left it there. This was the first time Maren Caldwell had touched him by choice, and not for any medical reason. Not to check his pulse, not to change a bandage, not to take his blood pressure, only to touch him, only to say with her hand what she did not say with her mouth. Aster looked down at her hand on his forearm. He did not pull away. He did not move. He only looked, and in that small clinic on Halsted Street, beneath the smell of antiseptic and the fluorescent lights, 14 years of caution, 14 years of calculation, 14 years of never allowing anyone to come close enough to hurt him, all of it cracked open at a place Aster Grayson had never thought to guard. Not at the place he watched most carefully, but at the place he forgot to watch at all, because he had never imagined that anyone would come from that direction, from a community clinic on the south side, from the roughened hand of a night shift nurse, who never once asked him who he was. The outside world came for Maren on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks after the final follow-up appointment. Her shift ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. She stepped out through the back door of the hospital, and she saw her car sitting in the parking lot. The passenger side window had been shattered. The side mirror had been bent inward, and on the shards of glass, still clinging to the door frame, someone had written a short message in red paint, clear enough that it needed no guessing. A warning. Maren stood there looking at the car, the parking lot empty, the security cameras behind the hospital long broken and never repaired. She didn't panic. She didn't call the police. She was angry. The cold, tightly held anger of someone who had spent a lifetime being pushed into corners by life and who had gotten back up every single time by her own strength. She got into the car with the broken mirror, started the engine, and drove away. Not home. In her mind, caught between anger and the growl of the engine in the late-night silence, a restaurant name rose from memory. The name she had heard Aster mention while delirious in her bed. The name she had told him she had not heard. The name she remembered perfectly, even though she did not want to remember it. She pulled over at the curb, opened her phone, typed the restaurant name into Google. The address appeared. Downtown, north of the Chicago River. She drove straight there. The restaurant was still lit at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. The kind of place where the lights outside told one story and the inside told another altogether. Maren parked the car with the broken mirror directly in front, stepped out, and walked in. She was still wearing her pale blue scrubs, her hair flattened after 16 straight hours, her face without makeup, her nurse's flat shoes still on her feet. She walked straight inside. 2 large men at the entrance stepped in front of her, looking at her the way people look at someone who has wandered into the wrong place. Maren did not stop walking. She looked straight into their eyes and said Aster Grayson's name. Not in a voice asking permission. In the voice of someone who was very angry and had no time to explain herself. One of the 2 men stepped aside, because there are moments when surprise outruns all security procedure, and a night shift nurse in hospital scrubs, eyes red from lack of sleep, walking straight into a restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning was not something anyone had a prepared response for. Maren crossed the main room and entered the private rooms in the back. Aster was seated at a long table, Perry standing beside him, and around the table were 4 or 5 men Maren did not know and did not need to know. All of them turned to look at her. Perry's hand went to his waist by reflex. Aster looked at her, and Maren saw the brief instant when his eyes widened by the smallest fraction, before returning to normal. "I need to talk to you," Maren said. No greeting, no apology for interrupting. "Right now." Aster looked at her for one more second. Then he said, in a calm voice, to the men around the table, "Out. All of you." Perry looked at Maren, then at Aster, then gave a nod. The room was empty within 15 seconds. Maren told him about the car, about the warning written on the broken glass. Then she said, and her voice did not shake, did not harden. It was only very clear, the way she would report test results to a patient. "If your presence brings danger to me, I need to know so I can decide for myself, not so you can decide for me." Aster was silent for a moment. Then he told her the truth. For the first time, he told the complete truth to someone outside the family. He told her who he was, what the Grayson family was, how the empire he ran truly operated, and how the rival family wanted to seize the southern real estate district he controlled, land that was being redeveloped and would soon be worth many times more, and how she, simply by standing near him, had become a piece they could use. He told her all of it, without softening anything, without dressing it up. Maren listened. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, looking down at the dark wooden table. Then she lifted her eyes to him. "I've spent my whole life with people who thought they had the right to decide for me," she said. "Don't become another one." Then she stood and walked out. Aster watched her until the door closed behind her. That same night, he called an emergency meeting with the rival family. Not with force. Aster placed a flash drive on the table, containing every piece of evidence of illegal transactions he had collected over the previous 4 years. Enough to drag that entire family down if it ever reached the FBI. He gave them 2 choices. Withdraw from the Southern District, or everything would be sent out the following morning. But the rival family did not yield easily. They chose one final strike before retreating, and that strike was aimed at the one place they knew Aster could not endure being touched. 3 days after the negotiation, Maren's shift ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. She stepped out the back door of the hospital, the familiar road, the empty parking lot, the stretch with no cameras. A car pulled sharply up to the curb. 2 men got out, fast, professional, quiet. They forced her into the vehicle before she could react. The door shut. The car sped away. Maren sat in the back seat between the 2 men, her hands bound with plastic zip ties. She did not scream. She did not beg. 3 years in a Southside emergency room had taught her how to stay calm inside chaos. She observed, remembered, counted the length of the drive, counted the turns. When the car stopped and they brought her into a warehouse, She sat down in the metal chair they pointed to and began twisting her wrists. Plastic zip ties. She knew how to break them. She tightened the restraint with her teeth until the locking block was centered between her wrists, then snapped both arms outward, hard and clean. The tie broke. Astor found her within 3 hours. The Grayson family's underground communication system moved faster than any police department ever could. Perry and his team overwhelmed the guards through numbers and discipline, with no significant struggle. When Astor stepped into the warehouse, he had prepared himself for every possible scene, but not this one. Marin was sitting in the metal chair, her hands already free, and she was kneeling beside one of the guards, a man who had been wounded in the arm during the brief clash when Perry's team came in. She was tearing fabric from her own sleeve to bandage his wound. A nurse's instinct. She could not watch someone bleed and do nothing, not even a man who had been holding her against her will. Marin lifted her head and looked at Astor standing in the warehouse doorway. Her eyes were calm, a little tired, and there was not the slightest look of someone who had just been rescued. "You're 3 minutes late," she said. "I was almost on my way out myself." Astor took Marin back to the third-floor apartment. In the car, she sat still, looking out through the window, saying nothing. When the car stopped, she opened the door herself, stepped out herself, and walked up the stairs herself. She needed no hand to steady her, no one to guide her. Astor followed behind her, watching her back, straight, steady, each step even, not trembling, not slowing. She opened the apartment door, went inside, turned on the light, walked straight into the kitchen, put the kettle on the stove, took out a cup, took out a tea bag. Every movement was precise, automatic, as though she were still in the middle of a shift, rather than having just been taken by force and held in a warehouse for 3 hours. Astor stood in the doorway and watched her make tea. She was calm. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not waver. She turned and asked whether he wanted anything to drink. Her voice normal, almost gentle. And Astor, the man who had read people for 14 years, the man who took pride in the belief that no one could hide anything from him, looked at her and believed she was all right, because Marin Caldwell was too good at being all right. She had been all right her whole life. All right when her father left. All right when she raised her sister alone from the age of 17. All right when Jess took all the money and disappeared. All right when she dragged a strange man up 3 flights of stairs in the middle of a snowstorm. She was so good at being all right that no one, not even Astor, thought he needed to ask again. Then Perry called. There was urgent business to handle. The aftermath of the night had to be cleaned away before dawn. Astor looked at Marin once more. She was sitting at the kitchen table now, both hands around her cup of tea, her eyes lowered, quiet. He gave her a slight nod, stepped out the door, and went with Perry. 4 hours later, Astor came back. Alone. No Perry, no driver, no black car. He drove his own car, parked in front of the apartment building, climbed the stairs, and stood outside the door of the third-floor apartment. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Silence. He put his hand on the doorknob and turned it. The door opened. It was unlocked. And that was the moment Astor knew something was wrong, because Marin Caldwell always locked the door. 3 years living alone on the South Side, working night shifts, coming home at 2 or 3 in the morning, she locked the door the way she breathed, without thinking, without ever forgetting. She was the kind of woman for whom a lock was the final line between herself and the rest of the world. She did not forget to lock her door, unless she was no longer in any state to remember the things she always remembered. Astor stepped inside. The apartment was dark. The lights were off. The cup of tea on the kitchen table had gone cold, not even half finished. He crossed the living room, looked at the bed, empty, then looked into the kitchen. Marin was sitting on the floor, her back against the refrigerator, her knees drawn up, both arms wrapped tightly around her shins. The light was off, but enough of the streetlight outside came through the window for him to see her. She was not crying. Her eyes were dry. But she was shaking. Her whole body was shaking. Not from the cold, but with the kind of tremor that comes from somewhere deep inside. The kind Astor had seen in soldiers after battle, when everything was over, when the danger had already passed, and the body finally allowed itself to react to what it had forced down for hours. The adrenaline drained away, and what remained was a shaking no act of will could stop. She did not lift her head when he came in. Perhaps she had not heard him, or perhaps she had heard him and no longer had the strength to respond. She only sat there, arms around her knees, shaking, alone in the dark kitchen of the little third-floor apartment, exactly as she had always been alone whenever the world knocked her to the ground. Astor said nothing. He did not ask whether she was all right. He did not say, "I'm here now." He did not say anything at all, because he understood that in this moment there was no right sentence, and every sentence would only be more noise for a person who needed quiet more than anything else. He walked over, and he sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the refrigerator, his shoulder touching hers. He did not pull her into an embrace. He did not take her hand. He only sat there, shoulder against shoulder, on the cold kitchen floor in the dark, exactly the way she had once sat on the floor of this apartment beside his bed when he had a fever, holding his hand through the night without a word. Now he did the same for her. He sat there. He did not leave. And he waited. Maren shook. Then she shook a little less, then less still. Then she stopped. She did not know how long it took. She only knew that at some point her shoulder leaned more heavily into his. Her head tilted. Her forehead came to rest against the fabric of his suit jacket, and she closed her eyes, not to sleep, only to close them, for the first time in that long night, with the feeling that she could close them without needing to stay on guard. Astor sat completely still. He kept his shoulder exactly where it was so she would have something to lean against. He looked straight out toward the window, where the streetlight fell through the old curtains, and he breathed in an even, slow rhythm, because he knew that sometimes the steady breathing of the person beside you is enough to bring you back to the ground. They sat there on the kitchen floor in the dark, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. The next morning, when Maren woke up on the kitchen floor, Astor was already gone. She wasn't surprised. She got up, showered, changed clothes, and went to her night shift. Life moved forward in the same rhythm she had always known. But what she didn't know was that during that night, on the drive back from the third-floor apartment to downtown Chicago, Astor Grayson had made a decision. The most painful decision he had ever made in 14 years. More painful than the night he lost his father. More painful than the morning his mother disappeared, because this time he wasn't the one being left behind. This time he chose to be the one who walked away. He had seen her shaking on the kitchen floor, and he understood. He understood that his world had touched her, had dragged her into a warehouse, had cinched plastic ties around her wrists, and even though she had broken them herself, even though she had stayed calm enough to bandage the arm of the man who had held her there, her body had still shaken at 3 o'clock in the morning on the dark kitchen floor. He was the reason, and if he stayed, there would be another time. There was always another time. His world did not allow anyone to stand close without paying a price. So Astor did what he did best. He disappeared. No envelope of money, no key to a new apartment, no explanation. He simply stopped. On the third follow-up visit, the waiting chair at the clinic on Halsted Street was empty. The double espresso no longer appeared on Maren's desk each morning. The black car at the corner near the hospital was no longer parked there. Maren called him. Perry answered, his voice calm, and said the boss was busy. She called a second time. Perry said nearly the same thing. She did not call a third time. 3 days of silence. 3 days in which the coffee Maren made for herself each morning at the hospital was still black and unsweetened, just as it had been before he appeared. But now every sip tasted different. 3 days in which she stepped out the back door of the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning and found the corner empty, dark, with no headlights casting their faint glow across the snow. 3 days in which the pipe in her apartment dripped water into the bucket in the kitchen, and no one called a plumber to fix it. Maren understood. She understood from the first day, because she had been left often enough in her life to recognize the signs. Her father had not said goodbye. Jess had not said goodbye. And now Astor Grayson had not said it either, because this was how men like him left. They did not slam doors. They simply stopped appearing, and the emptiness they left behind was larger than any door closing hard. On the fourth day, Maren did not call. She finished her night shift, went home, changed clothes, and drove to Astor's real estate tower in downtown Chicago. She had been there once before in the past few weeks, when everything between them had been shifting slowly, and she had come to pick him up after a late follow-up appointment. She knew the address. She knew the floor. She pushed through the glass doors, stepped into the lobby, and saw Perry standing at the reception desk. He saw her and stepped into her path, not roughly, only placing himself between her and the elevator, looking at her with the look she had come to recognize, the look that assessed, weighed, measured. Then he pulled out his phone, placed a call, said a few short words, and waited in silence. Aster, on the other end of the line, was silent for a few seconds. Then he said one word. Perry gave a nod, stepped aside, and let Marin pass. She entered his office. The room was large, with dark furniture and glass walls looking out over the Chicago skyline. Aster sat behind the desk. He looked exhausted. The shadows beneath his eyes were deep, his cheekbones sharper, and Marin, with a nurse's eye, knew at once that he hadn't slept in at least 3 nights. On the desk in front of him lay a set of documents. Marin glanced at them only long enough to recognize what they were. Papers for a new apartment, papers for a car, a thick envelope. Everything prepared for her. Everything unsent. Marin did not look at the papers again. She pulled out the chair opposite his desk, sat down, placed both hands on her thighs, and looked straight into his eyes. "You think you're protecting me?" Aster did not react. His face stayed unchanged, that same mask of 14 years, unreadable, revealing nothing. "But do you know what really protected me these past few months?" Marin continued, her voice not shaking, not cold, only very clear. "Not the black car, not Perry, not money." She paused, looked at him, and when she spoke the next sentence, her voice softened. But every word carried more weight than anything she had said before. "It was the fact that you sat down on the kitchen floor beside me that night and didn't say a word. If you take that away, that's when you're truly hurting me." Silence. The large office suddenly felt smaller, as if the air had been drawn out of it and only the two of them remained, with the wooden desk between them. Aster looked at her. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, the woman who had broken her own restraints in a warehouse, had knelt down to bandage the arm of the man who held her, had walked past his guards into a restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning, and was now sitting in his office, not begging, not crying, not asking him to stay, but forcing him to look at the truth. She had not come here to hold on to him. She had come to tell him that if he chose to leave, then he needed to know exactly what he was taking away. Aster lowered his eyes to the file on the desk. The new apartment, the new car, the account full of money, the way he had solved everything for 14 years. With money, with assets, with neat arrangements made from a distance, by turning every relationship into a transaction, so that when it ended, both sides could walk away without owing anything. But the woman sitting in front of him had once returned the envelope of money he sent and kept the emergency medical kit. She did not take his money. She took what was useful. And the most useful thing he had ever given her had not been inside any envelope. It had been on the kitchen floor at 3 o'clock in the morning, when he sat down beside her and said nothing. Aster reached out. Slowly, he placed his palm over the file and pushed it aside. He said nothing. He only pushed it aside. The papers slid across the wooden desk, making a soft rustling sound in the quiet room. The file came to rest at the edge of the desk, out of reach of both of them. The sound of paper sliding over wood. That was all. But it was the sound of a man deciding to stop running away. A few months passed. Chicago moved from winter into spring, slowly and patiently, in the way only cities that have endured brutal cold know how to change. Aster Grayson did not walk away from the family, because real life is not a fairy tale, and 14 years of building cannot be pushed aside by one romantic decision. But he shifted, slowly, deliberately, one step at a time, moving the legal side forward and narrowing the underground side behind it. No one in the family fully understood why, except Perry, and Perry said nothing. Marin Caldwell was still a night shift nurse in the Mercy emergency room, not because she needed the money, because her life was different now, but because that was who she was. That was what she had chosen before she ever met Aster, and that was what she would keep choosing whether he existed in her life or not. But now, every night, when she stepped out the back door of the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a black car parked at the corner. And sometimes, inside the car, it was not the driver. Inside the car was Aster, sitting behind the wheel, saying nothing, only opening the passenger side door. Then one night, in the middle of her shift, Marin's phone vibrated. A message. She looked at the screen. Jess, her sister. 2 short lines. "Sis, I'm sorry. I want to see you." Marin stared at the message for a long time. She did not reply. She turned the phone face down on the staff room table, stood, washed her hands, and went back to her shift, as if nothing had happened. Her hands were still quick, still precise, still handling each patient without missing a beat. But in the spaces between cases, when she stood alone in the empty hospital corridor, Her eyes drifted down toward the phone lying face down on the table, and she knew those 2 lines were still there, waiting patiently, exactly the way Jess had always known how to wait for the moment when Marin was weakest before appearing. The shift ended. Marin stepped out the back door. The black car was at the corner. She walked to it, opened the door, and sat down in the passenger seat. Aster was in the driver's seat. He looked at her and did not ask. She sat still for a while, looking through the windshield, at the night sky paling in the east, at the last streaks of snow melting across the street. Then she took out her phone, opened the message, and handed it to him. Aster took the phone and read it. 2 lines. When he finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he handed the phone back to her. He did not say you should forgive her. He did not say you should cut her off. He did not say, if I were you, I would do this. He did not advise. He did not judge. He did not decide for her. He only said, in a low, calm voice, as though it were the simplest truth he had ever spoken, "Whatever you choose, I'm here." Marin looked at him. Then she gave a slight nod, said nothing, and slipped the phone back into the pocket of her coat. Aster started the engine and drove away from the hospital. That morning, when the first light of the new day spread across the Chicago skyline, they were sitting together on the old bench outside Mercy Hospital. The same bench where Marin had sat alone so many times after long shifts, looking out at the empty parking lot, drinking cold coffee, and reminding herself that she did not need anyone. Now she sat there with Aster, shoulder against shoulder, 2 cups of coffee in their hands, the air still cold but the worst of winter already behind them. The snow was melting. The street was wet, reflecting the soft light of early morning. Marin's phone lay on her lap, Jess's message still unanswered. She still did not know what she would do. She still did not know whether she would forgive, whether she would open the door again or keep it closed, whether she would give Jess a second chance, or let those 2 lines sink beneath the hundreds of old messages she never read again. She did not know yet, but for the first time, she knew that whatever she chose, she would not be choosing it alone. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so that more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you do not miss the next stories. Tell us how you felt about Marin and Aster's story by leaving a comment, because we always want to hear what lives deep inside your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.